This is a representation of my undergraduate thesis that I titled Telos, T-E-L-O-S, All About It, Classical, Modern, and Christian Heroism in Lord of the Rings. In The Hero of a Thousand Faces, Joseph Campbell argues that the modern hero is centered on the idea of the actualized self. This idea grew out of Jung's concepts on the same subject. Jung argues that the essential function of the heroic myth is the development of the individual's ego consciousness, his awareness of his own strengths and weaknesses, in a manner that will equip him for the arduous tasks with which life confronts him. Modern heroism relies on a new and intriguing idea of the self, considered as distinct and independent from a community. With modern heroism, the quest is an internal journey toward self-knowledge and actualization. Campbell states that modern man has constructed a society in which the gods are no longer needed. He says, "It is the hero cycle of the modern age, the wonder story of mankind's coming to maturity. The spell of the past, the bondage of tradition, was shattered with sure and mighty strokes." In its simplest form, the progression implied here is that man has grown from dependence upon gods, and by extension religion and tradition, to a secular and liberated man. We are no longer trapped by a literal understanding of mythology. Interestingly, Campbell does not argue for the abolishment of myth. He recognizes man's need to create, and perhaps even our desire to rely on myth. It has always been the prime function of mythology, and right, to supply the symbols that carry the human spirit forward, he says. He continues on with, "Apparently, there is something in these initiatory images so necessary to the psyche that if they are not supplied from without, through myth and ritual, they will have to be announced again through dream from within. Myths, we can say, are outward expressions of archetypal layers of the soul. Myths allow us to let characters, ideas, virtues, and vices interact with each other on a fictional level. We can take parts of ourselves and mix them with the divine. Myths appeal to our fundamental desire to use parts of ourselves to create. Most importantly, despite Campbell's presentation of modern man and heroism as achieving actualization, he cheerfully admits man's necessity on myth. As much as we may want to claim individual independence, then, we cannot make sense of ourselves until we place ourselves, at least temporarily, in the context of myth. Observing our relationship to the modern hero will be the most helpful to us, since the hero of a specific age will tell us what society values in its men. Instead of being concerned with man's place in a cosmic design, modern society wants to promote the individual." Campbell explains the situation thusly. "The problem of mankind today, therefore, is precisely the opposite to that of men in the comparatively stable periods of those great coordinating mythologies. Then all meaning was in the group, in the great anonymous forms, none in the self-expressive individual. Today no meaning is in the group, none in the world, all is in the individual. But there the meaning is absolutely unconscious. One does not know toward what one moves. One does not know by what one is propelled." Campbell has set up a fascinating dilemma here. On the one hand, his tone suggests that it is for the good that we have evolved from anonymous identities to the self-expressive individual. However, although modern man may have his individual identity, apparently he has lost a sense of his natural end, or telos in the Greek, and his place in a social context or community. The modern hero's confusion arises over the fact that, as Campbell reminds us, man still needs myth, and for myth we need the community. We did not spontaneously arrive at the idea of the modern hero. If it is true, as Jung says, that the image of the hero evolves in a manner that reflects each stage of the evolution of the human personality, then it would be helpful to trace some of those keynotes in the evolution of the hero. The most important types of heroes for us today to focus on are the classical, the modern, and the Christian. Each one of these has its own specific relationship between, as we've mentioned, the self and the community. In the midst of the melee over the different visions of the hero, we find J.R.R. Tolkien. His work, The Lord of the Rings, takes all of these elements of the history of the hero, Greek, Roman, modern, and Christian, and lets them play out in human action. Caldecott, citing Tolkien's own letter, said, "The plot is concerned with the ennoblement or sanctification of the humble." The purpose of my thesis will be to explore these approaches to the hero as they play out in Lord of the Rings, while looking at how humility can relate to heroism. For Tolkien was a man living in modernity, but a scholar of the classics, and therefore uniquely qualified to address this issue. The first noticeable reference we see to heroes in the Middle-earth realm is in The Hobbit. "That would be no good," said the wizard, "not without a mighty warrior, or even a hero. I tried to find one, but warriors are too busy fighting one another in far-off lands, and in this neighborhood heroes are scarce, or simply not to be found." Tolkien's capitalization of the word hero is critical. It alerts us to the fact that Tolkien is acutely aware of the mythological archetypes of the hero. Tolkien's awareness of these archetypes provides us with a concrete reason to explore further into this topic. More importantly, though, Tolkien introduces the Christian hero. Gunnar Durang, in an essay on Tolkien, says, as Tolkien argues in his essay on Beowulf, "Great heroes, like great saints, should show themselves capable of dealing also with the ordinary things of life, even though they may do so with a strength more than ordinary." The primary mark of the hero, regardless of what kind of hero, is the virtue of courage. The specific demonstration of the hero's courage depends on how he views the relationship between the self and the community. Tolkien will explore these conceptions of the hero: classical, which is subdivided into Greek and Roman, modern, and Christian. I will argue that Tolkien uses composite characters to show us composite heroes. Instead of ranking the heroes, Tolkien shows that the classical and modern heroes are necessary but insufficient, and that the Christian hero is an illuminating combination and redemption of the classical and the modern hero. We will be able to trace the differences between each kind of hero by how he sees himself in relation to the community and how he demonstrates courage. For the Greeks, their idea of a hero was one who achieved glory and fame, or kleos in Greek, on the battlefield, like Achilles. Maurice McNamee, in his study on the epic hero, tells us, "One of the most striking and characteristic features of Greek culture is its self-centeredness. The Greek hero is individualistic, self-sufficient, and proud. Even so, this kind of hero is not wholly selfish. Greek heroism does have an emphasis on the self, or the hero, but the self is not considered in isolation. The Greek hero's actions are done for himself, for quite practically, if there is no one else in society, then there is no one who can accord him this kleos, or honor and glory. Because the Greeks did not have much faith in the idea of an afterlife, as we think of an afterlife, the hero was especially motivated to prove himself in the present and on the battlefield. The Romans shifted away from the Greeks' obsession with pugilistic heroism and focused instead on moral action. McNamee says, "The chief glory of Cicero's great man arises from his fulfillment of his duties to others." The Roman hero had the good of the city or the commonwealth at heart. Aeneas, for example, sacrifices his own personal love for Dido for a greater good, the founding of Rome. The good of the city and its people is uppermost in the Roman hero's mind. We spent much of the introduction discussing the modern hero, but he must be included again for the sake of our linear argument. The modern hero faces a radically different world than the classical heroes. Campbell has told us that modern man no longer sees a need to be dependent on the gods. He says it is not society that is to guide and save the creative hero, but precisely the reverse. For as much as the modern hero has cast off the classical and antiquated notions of the community, he still retains traces of their ethos. In this specific passage, Campbell states that the modern hero must not be led by the common masses of society. Much like the classical heroes, especially the Greeks, considered themselves above the common man. We turn again to Campbell to provide us with a reference point for the modern hero. With these fateful words, Count Leo Tolstoy opened the novel of the spiritual dismemberment of his modern heroine, Anna Karenina. During the 7 decades that have elapsed since that distracted wife, mother, and blindly impassioned mistress threw herself beneath the wheels of the train, thus terminating with a gesture symbolic of what already had happened to her soul, her tragedy of disorientation. Anna Karenina, as an example of a modern hero, has an entirely internal struggle. The modern hero, if he wants to successfully unite himself or herself, must undergo an annihilation of the human ego. What is important here is that the modern hero's death, seen in Anna Karenina, is in danger of being a total erasing of the self instead of a death and a rebirth of the self. The fundamental difference between the classical and modern hero is the following. The classical hero faces external enemies and displays his courage on the battlefield. The modern heroes face internal enemies and struggles, and by defeating his inner demons, hopes to gain self-actualization. That is, granted, an oversimplification of both heroes, but it is an appropriate and working definition for my thesis. Additionally, the classical heroes fought for the common good, whether that good was their reputation as a warrior or the good of their city. So even if the classical heroes did not submit themselves to the rules of a community, they recognized its existence and necessity. The Christian hero takes this idea of self-sacrifice and raises it to incredible heights. The Christian hero is called both to the external and internal sacrifice of self. Christ tells us in the New Testament that greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. Since Christians are also called to model their behavior on Christ, and Christ died for his people, then Christians are most definitely called to be martyrs if the situation calls for it. There is also the internal sacrifice of self that Christians must embrace. In a negative sense, it is the denial of the disordered desires for the self. In a positive sense, though, that denial of the self is for the good of the self and the community, be it for a whole city or simply for one's neighbor. The Christian hero combines sacrifice with a sense of deep humility, or what I will call a courage of humility. Tolkien critic Mark Smith says that battle is the milieu often associated with courage. But in battle, courage is often the only alternative to death. In some ways, it takes more courage simply to show up. McNamee looks to the Christian figure of Jesus as a model of Christian heroism. His claims to be divine, and yet his refusal to accept the honors and acclaim, would have made Christ, in Greek eyes, a kind of apotheosis of the pusillanimous man. This new emphasis on the dignity and worth of every single human individual was a corrective both to the Roman aberration of the total subordination of the individual to the state, and to the Greek unlimited self-aggrandizement and pursuit of personal glory. Christian heroism is surcharged with the same humble realization of one's entire dependence upon God for all that one is, and that whatever one has, he has from God, not entirely for himself, but also in trust for one's neighbor. Christian heroism, then, takes on a new depth and complexity with Tolkien. The virtue of courage in heroes, demonstrated in dramatic ways with our classical heroes, takes on a new form with the Christian hero. Christian courage is both interior and exterior, and more concerned with the death and rebirth of the self than the annihilation of self. We will start, then, with Boromir.